Okay. So what I kind of want to do, so this is kind of, there's a history of this within within the Ruby brigades in the past, is looking at whenever there's like a new release of the language, or whenever there's a new release of the like the Rails framework, to kind of just go through and look at the changes and see if any of those are interesting and what that might look like. There are actually a number of things that have happened in the Rails and Ruby community that I haven't really paid a whole lot of attention to, although that I knew that they were there. And I guess that speaks a little bit to the maturity of the Ruby community, that like the new features that come in that are like developer convenience or developer experience features just sort of like fold right into the day-to-day experience of the developer. Because one of the things that they added was, I don't remember the name of the feature, and maybe we can go look at the Ruby side of things too, but there's a feature now basically that if the key and the value, like if the symbol key and the value of something in a hash are the same, like it's a variable name that's the same as the key name symbolized, you can omit the end, right? Which is something I think that you've kind of been able to do with JavaScript for quite a while, by various different techniques. Other languages have that. Yeah, the new hash syntax. Yep. Which is nice because I have a whole lot of code that I wrote, and Alex, you get to experience some of that, where we assembled a whole bunch of different things together and then built a hash of that in order to basically JSONize it across the wire. And so sometimes it's really nice to be able to just omit that value. So there's like little developer conveniences things. There's some nicer things, but ultimately all that stuff we just got for free because we said, give us the new version of Rubocop, and then the new version of Rubocop has new opinions about things, and then autocorrect, and it just like takes away all of the things, and it kind of produces the result that would take us a long time to do manually in a single commit. So I just thought, I feel like I'm falling a little bit behind on some of those things, and I suspect that even though Rails 7 isn't like brand new, a lot of people probably haven't really looked at it yet to understand what's in there and what's changed. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to go through the release notes of that and maybe look at a couple of like the Prag Prog books that have come out and see if there's some interesting material in there, and really treat this meetup more as a learn together kind of a thing rather than a presentation style. Although I can present the the webpage and we can talk through it. I'm just kind of curious if people are using features that are coming out and what they actually are. So I guess before we get started, we can go around. If you want to talk, feel free to to say something. But if you don't want to, just stay silent, and we'll skip over. But we can do some introductions. So how about Alex? Do you want to go first? Do you want to say who you are, maybe your background into how you got into Ruby, and what you're doing with it right now?
Sure. I'm new to Ruby, actually. I'd say a couple weeks now. I'm learning the syntax and the Rails framework at the moment. Trying to get onboarded onto this AMP project right now, where I'm inheriting a lot of it's a Ruby and Rails and React front end app, and I'm really enjoying the syntax of it. There's a lot to learn. It's very similar and very different from other programming languages I've worked with. So yeah, I'm just excited to learn more about it. It's fun to program with.
Okay, welcome, Alex. Andrew. Andrew, if you're talking, I can't hear you.
No.
Good. Are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hey, okay, cool. I will start again. I'm Andrew. I work with Alex and Nola and Tim at Launch Scout. Haven't really done much Ruby, kind of, peripherally familiar with the ecosystem and all. I think I built a blog in 15 minutes once.
That's a good one.
But yeah, just here to learn.
All right. Zachary?
Hello. I assume you can hear me.
Yes.
Awesome. So How I got into Ruby. I started learning it on the side. I found a job where I use it every day now, which is cool.
That's cool.
We actually upgraded to Rails 7, so looking forward to using the new syntax and whatever comes with it. And there was a second question, which I'm failing to answer.
I think you got it. Ooh, yeah, yeah, you answered.
All right. So,
It's good to see you again. It's been a little while since I've seen you.
yeah, it's been growing into the role a little bit.
How long did it take you? I have two questions for you, if you don't mind answering. How big is your Rails app relative to something? And how long did it take you to upgrade?
It's taken us a couple months since they released it. I think it was in December, or maybe that was the Ruby 3 guy,
Yeah,
but I didn't really help with the upgrade, honestly. I'm just
Okay.
happy to be a user using that. But
That's
how
cool.
long have I been doing Ruby? It's been maybe a good year or two. It's a lot more fun to write than Java. So yeah.
Yep, I found that to be true coming from Java as well. Yeah, so Ruby has a history of doing releases on Christmas Day, which I think is just, I love it. It's like the Christmas present to the world is here's your new version of Ruby. So I like that part myself too. Ula.
Hello guys. My short name is Ula. I work at like now Launch Scout, and I'm in a project where we use Ruby and React. So I've been exposed to Rails for a couple of years now, and enjoying it, and hope to learn more from Tim today about Rails 7, because we are currently on Rails 6.
Cool. Thank you, Ula. Yeah, so I don't think I have any projects that are on Rails 7. The most recent upgrade that I believe that I worked on was on the project that Alex is on, and we went to Rails 6. And I remember, so if you have been in Rails for a while, then you probably have remembered some of the gigantic pain of the very early versions of Rails while it was still sort of normalizing and stabilizing. So I was, I think, on Rails 0.99 way back. And then I kind of walked away for a little while doing other things in Java and all of that. But came back to, people had done some upgrade projects from Rails 2 to Rails 3, and that was a lot of pain. And then Rails 3 to Rails 4 was significant pain as well. 4 to 5 was actually fairly straightforward. I mean, I think that was when they changed some of the belongs to relationship requirements and things like that. There were a lot of changes. And every time there's a major release of Rails, they give you like a very detailed upgrade guide. Like, here's how to go from the version that you're on to the newest one. And that's really helpful because you can run, there's a runner thing, there's a script that you can run that basically tries to make all the changes for you, but sometimes the changes it makes don't make a lot of sense unless you have that context. But 4 to 5 was a little bit challenging. 5 to 6 was almost seamless. Like I remember thinking, oh, there's a new version of Ruby and there's a new version of Rails. We should get on that. And then the upgrade process was just, I mean, I don't even really remember it taking more than maybe a day to do that upgrade. Now, granted, this is not a huge project. It isn't small though. It's got quite a bit of functionality and used a lot of things that were either deprecated or needed to change over. But coupling the upgrade scripts, the guide, and Rubocop and its new opinions about how to do things, I did not have any bad experiences at all with the upgrade. So I'm kind of expecting the same from 6 to 7. But I don't have any firsthand experience of it first. So it is kind of cool to see that Zachary, that there's one of the people here has gone through that upgrade process. One of the things that's important to note about Rails is its support, essentially the community support agreement that they have, which isn't to say that like Mats or DHH are gonna like come to my office if I have a problem, but there are security, like Rails has a specific pattern of what they support. And so if I remember correctly, it's the newest version, the newest major release, and then the major release behind it. And I believe it's the most recent, or maybe the most recent 2 releases within those major versions. So you can't get too far behind with Rails without essentially basically going out on your own or having to pay for a third-party company to support you if you have a problem. And there are companies that do that, and they do charge a lot of money. And so, you know, you're either striking out on your own if you fall too hard behind, or you're paying somebody a lot of money to keep you sort of with a fallback mechanism if you start having problems in your production environment or something like that. We've been on a couple projects that were far enough out of date that they actually did pay for that, and that, like, the obsolete tax is pretty large. So cool. I guess unless there's anything else that anybody else wants to do or has done with Rails 7 already, I was just going to bring up the guide and the release announcement and kind of like start working through piece by piece some of the things that they put in there. So if you have any other way that you want to do it, speak up now, because here I go. I'm going to start sharing my screen here in just a second. All right. I'm going to turn, I've got 2 different Zoom sessions going here, so I'm going to turn my video off on this one, and you'll just see the whole room of me and these wipes and everything that are here on the table. So Rails 7 is, I know of a couple of the major swaths of things that they've tried to accomplish, and actually some of the things that they've been hinting at or working towards have been in Rails 6 and even earlier versions. So I know a little bit about what we're going to see, but I haven't actually read through this entirely myself. So if there's anything here that, as we're like kind of reading through and looking at the highlights of this, that jump out at you and you have questions about, we can talk about it. I'll probably, the 2 things that I think are the most interesting for me actually both relate to JavaScript. One of them is essentially Rails deprecating Webpacker, and the other one is the use of Hotwire, which includes essentially Turbo, the Turbo framework, Stimulus, and some other things to build really rich client experiences, but without a whole lot of JavaScript. And so it's interesting. We've kind of talked a little bit about Hotwire in the past, and we've been here struggling and trying to work through what it really means to like embrace that and understand it. So it's been really interesting to me just to see this whole movement. But Webpacker has essentially, as far as I can tell, been deprecated in favor of something called import maps. And there's really like the build tooling system, once you get used to it, is almost non-existent. Like you don't have to think about it a whole lot because you're not building a lot of like big React components if you're doing it with Hotwire. So the whole thing is just interesting, but I think maybe let's just jump into it and read some of this. So December 15th, it looks like Rails 7 was released potentially before like the most recent version of Ruby that got released. But yeah, so the one of the big things is the exciting standard for import maps. I actually didn't find out that they made this change until a previous meetup where we were doing something with Hotwire from scratch. And I got really befuddled by the fact that I didn't have like a Webpacker YAML file or something to go look at. I just accidentally used the new Rails 7 generators for the app, and I had to learn about import maps kind of on the fly. So that was fun, but it's really interesting because I do think that for a lot of projects that start embracing Hotwire from the start, and less about like a front end and back end separated practices, like for smaller apps especially, or for teams that are like full stack teams already. This kind of lets you get out of the business of trying to tweak your Webpack configuration from day one. And that's kind of been one of the biggest pain points, is it didn't matter whether you used React or Vue or something else, you ended up with some kind of build tool for that is almost always more complicated in my experience than backend language building tools. So this is interesting just because, you know, hopefully it promises to and delivers on simplifying some of that build packaging. And they call it the no node default approach to the front end. One of the funny things that I've noticed about Node and specifically is that if you have a project that uses Node and uses Webpack by default, so like if you look at like Elixir and Phoenix or Ruby and Rails or any of the others, what you almost inevitably see is that, and this was startling to me when I first saw it, if you want to actually build an Elixir application with Phoenix 2 years ago, not only did you have to have Node installed, but you also had to have Python. So like Python was a build dependency for an Elixir Phoenix application, just so that you could have some rich JavaScript interaction. Because what happened is Node would almost immediately pull in some kind of native dependency that's compiled through Python. And then if your build environment didn't support all of the languages and all of the frameworks, you couldn't build. It was like step 0 is install Python, and then step 1 is install Node, and then step 2 is install Elixir and Phoenix or Rails and Ruby. So I welcome this, because I think having a dependency on a completely different language that you're not actually going to use in day-to-day development, just sitting there on the build machine so that you can make the project that you're trying to build, is just kind of silly. So I welcome the no Node default approach to the front end. And I think both Elixir and Phoenix and Rails and Ruby have adopted this approach that is almost apathetic to the JavaScript environment. And what I mean by that is, before they had to have an opinion, they had to take a stance, and the stance had to be essentially Webpack. And I don't think anybody was really happy about that. But the first question that somebody would ask is, how do I put this React component in on the front end? Or how do I, build a map integration or something like that? And the only answer that they really had for that was, well, you need JavaScript. And if you need JavaScript, then the default to go to is Webpack and probably React. What I think they've found is a more comfortable middle, which is, by default, you don't get anything other than you can build your JavaScript assets, and you can throw in a dependency if you want. So Elixir and Phoenix have thrown in ES build. Rails and React have thrown in import maps as the process to do that, but there's no Webpack configuration. So you're not like fiddling around with JavaScript build tools just to deploy the first time, because it's got to build static assets and put them in the right spot. There's really none of that. So you can get to production without any of it. And then if you find later, yeah, we really do want this separate front-end discipline or separate front-end practice, and they want to use their build tools and they want to use Webpack, you can always bring that in. But there's sort of like an agnosticism or an apathetic approach to that, right? Rails doesn't care what you use to build the JavaScript. Its default implementation is pretty lightweight versus what it used to be. Has anybody used the import map stuff for anything in like production or anything? I'm guessing not. It's pretty much like it introduced itself. It kind of wedged its way in for me in practice accidentally. And it took me a little bit, maybe 15 minutes to wrap my head around what was going on. And then we just kind of moved on and it worked. So I have a feeling that it'll only really show up on new apps, because if you've already done the work to bring in Webpack and everything else, and Webpacker, which was probably built by the generator, you're just going to get that and use it. I don't see a lot of people replacing it for import maps unless they're just fed up with their front end build system. So the next little paragraph here about Rails 7 is on Hotwire. Do I need to do a font bump? Can everybody see this okay? Give me like a thumbs up if you can see it, or a thumbs down if you can, because I can do a font bump if you can. Cool. Take that. Oh, everybody. All right, unanimous. I guess I should do it too. Yeah, unanimous. Okay, so one of the other introductions, this is not new for Rails 7. Hotwire as a concept is actually independent of Rails, right? It gets its root from Rails. So there used to be something called turbo links in Rails, which has been replaced by Hotwire because Turbo essentially replaced turbo links. If you ever dealt with a Rails application in the past, you either embraced and loved turbo links, and there were a good number of people who did, or you absolutely hated it, and it was alongside like Spring was the first thing that you removed if you accidentally let the generator make a Rails app for that. Does that resonate with anybody? Has anybody ever generated one with turbo links and then had the problem come up where they put a link in that tried to like preload the next page in the background, but didn't quite work because the JavaScript wasn't hooked up quite right, and so like nothing in the app worked when you clicked a link? Anybody else have that experience? I'll take that as a no. I had a couple of experiences with that, and it had to do with turbo links, me not understanding it, and as well as its desire to aggressively prefetch and cache things and turn applications that weren't designed as single page apps into kind of like a single page app by doing like asynchronous fetches and posts of forms and stuff, and then loading on top of the DOM the thing that changed, versus actually just going and doing a traditional HTTP response for that. So Hotwire combines a couple of things together, and it has its own web page and it has its own documentation. And if we go there, Hotwire obviously stands for HTML over the wire. I say obviously only because I have to think through the acronym a lot of times when I do it. So it's obvious to me, but not to everybody else. But Hotwire, what it does is it combines Turbo, which has a couple of different things. It uses Turbo Drive, which is kind of like Turbo Link's behavior in the past. Something called Turbo Frames, which is a way to replace information in the DOM in like a DSL based on like a subset of HTML or a superset of HTML that lets you embed HTML inside of a command of where that goes to be replaced, what frame that goes to be replaced in. And then it also has this concept called Turbo Streams, which is a way to asynchronously stream those Turbo Frame responses to the browser so that you can do asynchronous posts and things like that and replace pieces of the HTML, pieces of the DOM on a live running page without doing a full reload. So it gives you a lot more control over what Turbo Links used to do. It's really powerful because it happens over whatever medium you choose. So you can have it be via an asynchronous form response. So you can essentially, through what used to be called Ajax, you can push asynchronously a form post and then get a response back and update parts of the page without reloading. But what's really interesting about it, and we covered this in a previous Ruby meetup, is that all of the plumbing is there for the Turbo Streams and the Turbo Frames, such that you can get the new content by any way that you want. So you could actually hook up a WebSocket, kind of like what Phoenix does with LiveView, and you could deliver Hotwire Turbo Stream responses with the Turbo Frame replace or edit or append commands in the markup over a WebSocket. And as it turns out, the way that Turbo works, if you just append all of that superset of HTML to the end of the document, it will process it automatically. It will see that those HTML DOM elements have been added to the bottom. It'll look at the fact that it's a Turbo Stream Frame response, and it will automatically execute those commands and change the screen. So you can actually, like, however you get that information, you can just append it to your page, and Turbo will handle it for you pretty much immediately and safely. That's pretty darn cool. And so we can go over that again sometime if that's interesting. But Hotwire gives us a lot of interesting ability then to do server-side rendering, similar to like a Next.js React kind of a thing, or a Phoenix and HTML, Phoenix and LiveView kind of a thing, where the server is rendering like a dead version, a static version of the page initially. And then as the browser loads up, it becomes hydrated or live. And then you can use WebSockets or behind the scenes posts and responses, as long as you handle the response from that correctly. Hotwire can handle a lot of the plumbing of replacing things on the screen for you, which gives you a lot of really cool things. It gives you SEO ability. So if you have a public page that relied a lot on JavaScript components to do the live reaction stuff, you don't need to have that static rendering done on the server anymore, because the thing that's rendering the views is actually going to be Rails in this case. And then the Hotwire is just the commands to replace things in the DOM. So you can actually get like a really good SEO version of your page right off the bat without having to do a lot of like wiring up and plumbing of server-side JavaScript rendering and stuff like that. I'm probably going into this a little bit more detail than we need to, but that allows you to basically, like Hotwire, with a couple of lines of JavaScript, you can set up WebSockets to do it. You can use the built-in Hotwire capability and basically write zero JavaScript and end up with these pages that are richly interactive, just like you would if you had to build a whole system in React and have like a JSON API or GraphQL endpoint or something like that to build the same kind of functionality, but you're only building it with one templating language, one backend language, and you don't have to do a lot of the plumbing between and build two different applications. So it's really powerful in terms of the productivity that you get from it. All right, I've been talking for a little while. Anybody have any questions or thoughts about that? Alex, have you encountered much of the Hotwire stuff yet?
No, not at all. This is all new to me right now.
Okay. I'll show you some stuff maybe next time. Like I might be in tomorrow if you're in the office, and I can show you a little bit of the stuff we've done with Hotwire. I will say the one thing that's a little bit challenging about it is coming from the live view side on the Phoenix and Elixir world. The model that it uses with processes, lightweight processes running on the server that control and maintain state for different areas of the screen with different live view components. In my head, that mental model makes a ton of sense. And it's kind of funny because when you think of functional programming languages, you think more stateless, right? You think more in terms of pure functions. If I get this input, then I'll have this output, and that's invariable. Like it will always be like that. Versus when you think of something like Rails, you tend to think that there's a heavier state being stored because of the whole object-oriented nature of it. It's actually backwards the way that the two models work. So in live view, you've got this lightweight running process that's controlling and maintaining state over a WebSocket and can handle events directly and then publish events out through the system and is very aware of the state of the browser relative to what the server knows. Where on the Rails side, if you use the default Hotwire implementation, there's not like a process that knows for your browser screen and the piece of text that you're looking at. There's no synchronization between those things. What you're doing is still essentially a traditional request response cycle. So you send in a request or command, the server has to load up the state that it needs in order to know who you are and what you're doing, and then send out a new replacement partial rendering of HTML. That's a little bit trickier. So I've had a little bit more trouble wrapping my head around how to use a sustainable, maintainable approach to Hotwire. I think we've gotten close, especially when we talk about like WebSockets and event-driven systems and channels and stuff like that. I've gotten a lot closer to understanding how I would use it on a project, but I don't think that I'm in the main, like, I don't think I'm in the middle of the big happy path as far as how Hotwire is intended to be used. So it is interesting. But there's a lot of things still to explore with it. In some ways, Hotwire is a rebranding, but in other ways, it's something brand new. So it's tricky to figure out the best practices for it. I will say the other interesting thing about Hotwire is it also encapsulates stimulus. And stimulus is interesting because you can't always do everything on the server side, right? If you need like a map component that has client-side Google Maps or something like that, it's not the right decision to push all that stuff onto your own server and make it the intermediary for some of that. So they have a stimulus side, which is all JavaScript. It's stimulus.js. And the interesting thing about stimulus is that it maps to elements on the screen very similar to how Rails as a server does. So stimulus, you can essentially hydrate controllers with DOM tags. Like if you use the right attributes on the right DOM elements, and then you write the right controller in the right spot, similar to everything else in Rails, there's a magical connection of those pieces when the page loads. And then you've got essentially a rich controller running on the client side, similar to the model view controller kind of style of the server. So if you really have to drop back and use JavaScript, there is an escape hatch, and that is stimulus. And you can use that for all kinds of things that should be on the browser. Sometimes accessibility and tab indexing and things like that really do belong in the browser rather than trying to get the server to do all that stuff for you. So like drop-down menus, dynamic menus, you don't need the server to render that the menu should be showing or hiding, right? That's kind of an attribute or a CSS class kind of a thing that can happen entirely on the client. So there's an escape hatch, which is really interesting. And stimulus is really interesting in that it works really, really well if you understand it. But it has the same kind of naming conventions and convention over configuration that Rails does. And so if you get anything wrong about stimulus, meaning kebab casing versus snake casing versus camel casing or anything like that, or miss one of the prefix words or something like that for hooking it up, then it just kind of doesn't work and you don't know why necessarily. So there's a little bit of work there, I think, in terms of tooling to help developers who are mere mortals like me understand how I'm supposed to use stimulus correctly. So it's interesting. It's a really powerful tool. It's a different way of thinking about things than React. It's a different way of thinking about it than Alpine.js. It's just kind of the Rails way of thinking about JavaScript. which is interesting because we've gone through this whole we've gone through these life cycles where everybody wanted to treat JavaScript as a language, like the language they were building in the back end, and like shoehorn it into their style. And then everybody started saying, no, we should treat it like its own thing. Like Douglas Crockford was like, hey, no, JavaScript's a real language. We should treat it like that. And then everybody sort of like built this front end mindset of let JavaScript shine and let's build things around that. And now this is kind of a step back in the other direction of actually, I really just want to build the server side and the client side interactions. I need them to be rich. That's the new expectation. But I don't want to have two teams thinking about two different problems. I want that to be like one whole team solution. So it makes sense to me, but we have a lot to figure out as far as an industry, like a Rails community, to figure out how to use Hotwire effectively to actually achieve the ends that they're trying with it. I've been talking a lot. Anybody have any ideas or thoughts about this stuff? Zach, are you doing anything with Hotwire? You said something about React before, right?
I mean, we've got some React stuff going on, but I'm mostly just doing backend stuff right now, so I don't really, unfortunately, get a chance to do much of this besides like working with ERB files. So,
okay. When you say you're doing
unfortunately, I don't have
backend,
much to contribute.
when you say you're doing backend stuff, are you doing things like integrating with third-party APIs that have no front end? Are you doing like reporting where you're building like spreadsheets and stuff, or are you building templated versions of things, but or potentially like JSON APIs or something like that? What does it mean when you say you're doing backend, or is it like some combination of this?
So, we're mostly. I work at Weedmaps now, so we're a.
Oh, hey,
you know,
congratulations!
yeah, so we don't really do, at least like the stuff I'm doing isn't integrating with third-party APIs. I know we've gobbled up a couple other companies, but I haven't really had to do much stuff with them. Most of the time when I'm talking about backend work, we're either, you know, doing some stuff with Elasticsearch, I guess, where we're, you know, trying to add some new property or something like that and return it to the front ends for them to ingest in a way that their React front end or whatever iOS / Android front end can digest that and you know, display it nicely to the users, that kind of stuff. Or like recently, it's been a lot of legal work, so not really the most exciting stuff. Haven't built an actual feature yet, but we're just you know, knocking out low-hanging fruit, I guess, is where we are now.
That's cool. Congratulations, by the way. How long have you been there?
I started last November, so it's been about half a year, I suppose.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, this is all pretty cool. I haven't really had a chance to mess with this yet.
Okay, so just kind of moving on here, we've got, so they kind of talk a little bit more about the tightly coupled embrace of Webpack and Webpacker, and they've stepped back from that and they have this other bundler, the import map kind of thing. And let's see, they've moved from, this is kind of more of a general across the industry approach. The default implementation of Sass is now in Dart. And so if you were using like any of the old versions that were maintained either in Ruby or in Node, you end up with a Dart version of it now if you do like an npm install. So I think that they're just kind of recognizing like people are using more Tailwind CSS versus Bootstrap, which used to be kind of like a minified version of Bootstrap that you'd get with Rails when you installed it. It used to be that the official implementation of Sass was in Ruby like a long time ago. And they're just kind of saying, you know, you get choices now. You can bundle things however you want, which is pretty cool. Yeah, this paragraph right here really resonates with me based off of what Chris McCord was saying. The same time that Phoenix jettisoned Webpack out of their default build and put ES build, they're like, you know what? As it turns out, most of the beginner questions, most of the beginner issues that came into the Phoenix core team through the GitHub page was, why doesn't this Webpack thing work? And they're like, we're not a Webpack project. We have to be right now because that's just what everybody else is doing, but everybody is struggling with Webpack and getting it up and running. And all we're trying to do is run a Phoenix app. And so I think they're both coming to the same conclusion that like, if we can get rid of node and NPM as requirements for the project to get started, then everybody can have a more productive start. And then if they need to pull it in later, they can. So kind of just rehashing what we talked about a little bit earlier. So some of these things are really interesting to me, and I haven't read much about them at all, but I am really, really interested because I've been on a project where we had record level and even field level encryption in the database, and it was an absolute pain. But if you know anything about DHH and Basecamp, the company, and some of the things he's been doing, he's been building an email, he's been building an email system called Hey. And apparently they had obviously to do some things with encryption with their email system. And so they've been pulling some of that stuff out and building it into Active Record, which is absolutely great, because if you had to bolt on encryption and decryption to fields in Active Record, the way to do it was not easy, and it was painful, and you had to manage keys and all kinds of problems. So this is really kind of interesting to me. I don't know the next time that I'm actually going to need this, but if you're working on a project that has PHI or PII, it's probably, or has GDPR or has to deal with the CCPA, with the California Consumer Privacy Act, I think. Any of those things that have like very strict expectations on you, or even if you're dealing with, I mean, it's not typical now to store credit card numbers or anything like that, but if you're storing any information transaction related, having encryption with Active Record kind of built in is like a game changer. So it feels like one of those things that like maybe 10 to 15% of projects really, really needed. But it was such an edge case, it was really hard to pull off well. And people would just rely on the fact that their databases were encrypted at rest, and that all, you know, end-to-end encryption was in place via the SSL layer. But this actually lets them, if there's a hack or a breach, which there always will be somewhere, it lets them basically separate the information out from how do you actually get the information once you've gotten a breach. So it's interesting. So I suspect that somebody here in the next year or two is probably going to need to look into this more on a project. But until then, it's nice to know that they're thinking about it and working on it. Does anybody actually have any experience having to do encryption either in Rails or something else? I've only been on 1.5 projects that cared about it a lot. Probably could have benefited from a couple of others, but interesting. So I don't know anything about the trace query origins feature. Yeah, I don't know anything about that. That might be an interesting thing for somebody to explore in a future one. This asynchronous query loading, this one is interesting. So I've found that it'll actually do, so this was a thing previously that if you used, what's the attachment system called? Oh my gosh, why can't I remember it? It replaced carrier wave and paperclip and all those things, or you could use them as backends for a while, I think too. But basically, Rails, it has its own attachment mechanism. Why can't I remember what that's called? Anyway, it doesn't matter a whole lot. If you had a file that was stored and tracked like using AWS that mapped to a record in the database, when you deleted that record, it would oftentimes use active job to synchronize up and delete that file asynchronously. So like the database operation was synchronous and would happen immediately, but then it would schedule a job that almost immediately ran after that to go clean up the file and get rid of it. This basically makes certain queries to, you can make some of your queries that are longer running to be asynchronous, and it basically offloads those to a separate process, runs them and brings them back. One of the interesting things about this is that if you have a one-to-many relationship with dependent destroy on the parent relationship, so if you have like, just trying to think of a good example, if you have an order and a bunch of order items, right? So the order is the top level parent record, and then there's a bunch of order items that belong to that. If you delete that order, what should happen to the order items? You have to specify that, otherwise it won't let you delete it. But if you have dependent destroy, there's like a new one that's like destroy later or something like that, that will now queue up the delete all functionality for each of those child records, but it doesn't do it in the same transaction immediately. So you can actually treat that like a job, and if you have something that would otherwise time out in a browser thread, you can do some asynchronous things with it now that you wouldn't have been able to do easily before. So I think that one's interesting just because they're recognizing that certain queries can take a long time. And before, what you had to do is basically not roll your own, but you had to like spin up your own active job to manage that and then synchronize that back to the main thread when it was done. So this one's interesting just to see what they've done with it and how that might be a little bit easier now. It also lets you parallelize certain things, which is kind of cool. So there's Zeitwerk, which is like the new autoloader constant naming system. Zeitwerk was new in, I think, 6. And you could choose to opt out of it, but now I think it looks like they got rid of the old style. I can't remember the name of it, but the code loader, basically how the code conventions, how you name things, all of that is now part of the Zeitwerk system. So one of my favorite things about the new one is that Spring is no longer on by default. Spring was a thing that really cached a lot of the Rails runtime loading, so that if you had to restart your Rails app a lot, which for bigger projects can take a really long time, it helped you to cache. But the problem was, whenever the cache broke in a way that was mysterious, it broke you in a way that you couldn't figure out easily. So you would work fine for 3 months and then have a weird Spring cache issue, and none of your code changes would look like they were loading. And then you'd eventually, after banging your head against the wall for probably 30 minutes or more, you'd say, oh, I wonder if this is Spring. And then you'd kill off the Spring process and everything would look like it was working again. So I always turned Spring off. I never had a Rails project that was so big or that I was so impatient about that I needed it. So I'm glad to see that they've turned it off by default, just because, you know, the apps tend to start up fast enough now anyway. The send stream, the action controller live stuff is really interesting, and you can like stream files that get generated on the fly. So if you're building a giant report, you can stream like pieces of that without having to store it all in memory on the server. So basically it takes the need from you to like pull a whole bunch of records in, process them and transform them all in one big thing, in one big space in memory, and then send that whole file down to the client all at the same time. You can basically stream things. So you can pull records out of the database, process them individually, transform them, do something that, you know, do whatever you need to do to transform those into the file that you're sending, and then you can stream it bit by bit, and you're not building up a giant chunk of memory, which on like Heroku, you'll get shut down if you use too much memory. So this is a way to basically manage memory and the database and your server, and get more responsiveness to your client without having to like store everything in chunks in memory. So that's pretty cool. So it'll parallelize test now automatically, apparently, to the number of CPU cores that you have, which is pretty cool. CPU, I think test parallelization is something that they've been working on for a while. And it looks like active storage was the thing that I was thinking of before, that stores files off. And it looks like they're using a better processor for that. So that's kind of the big highlights of Rails 7. Is there anything that's in there that we didn't really spend a lot of time on that's interesting, that caught your eye, that you'd be interested to go into more?
The file streaming stuff sounds neat, but I'm fairly certain that's pretty trivial in Elixir Live View land, right?
It is. So in Elixir, there's a lot of one-to-one replacements essentially with the enum to the stream modules. Actually getting Elixir to stream things the way that you think that it's doing it is a little bit trickier. See you, Ula. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Tim, I have another commitment. Sorry. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, streaming in Elixir is deceptively simple, but also if you look at the code, like I've written code that I thought was correct and then I realized was not. But that whole framework of being able to like map over something lazily and say, these are all the stream changes that I want to do, and then it really only has to like traverse that once, is really powerful once you figure out how to do that well. So I think the same thing happens here, right? You have to like figure out how to stream efficiently from the database, and you have to have something that is streamable, right? Like if you're building a report that has like a bunch of different joins to a bunch of different tables, and you're pulling back with like a cursor record by record, you have to be able to transform that record into whatever it is you're trying to do in the report to be able to stream it effectively. So there's a lot of considerations there, and it won't work for everything, but there are a good number of things that I've done before that we had to really work to optimize memory usage. Otherwise Heroku would shut down our what is it called? Our process. I can't remember what our worker thread or whatever. So yeah, that is really interesting. I've done a little bit with SendStream, but it seemed pretty immature a couple of years ago when we were trying to use it to help the servers that we were running on have better memory usage. Anything else? I guess one other thing that I want to cover really quick then, and we can call it for today, is Pragmatic Programmer has 2 books now for Rails 7. One of them, I thought I had enter here. There we go. One of them is Agile Web Development with Rails 7. This is the venerable guide. I bought the very first one of these, and it really helped me to understand model view controllers and everything. But this is kind of just the continuation of kind of the de facto introductory guide to Rails. I think there's other ones that are better probably at this point, depending on what background you're coming from and how much you know already. But this one was kind of like the very first. Once you got the pickaxe book from Dave, this was like your very next step. And this was the pragmatic version or the practical version of how do I build an app alongside the giant pickaxe book that had like the reference API for all of the Ruby standard API. So this is a venerable book, and written by Sam Ruby. So I mean, obviously you have to get it. The other one that's really interesting that I actually just bought a copy of for myself is there's a modern, where did it go? Modern front-end development for Rails. And this one's, I think, the one that's like brand new, published, nope, not brand new, it's June 2021. But it covers Hotwire, Stimulus Turbo, and React. So it's really interesting to me just because it also includes React in there. And that's kind of, I kind of want to know where they were going with that. Just to understand like how they would integrate that, because that is something that I haven't really attempted to try to do. But there you go. So there's another opportunity here for Hotwire, Stimulus, and Turbo. It looks like they're doing it with a TypeScript approach. So you can also kind of pick up a little bit of typing systems and stuff as you go if you pick that one up. But if it makes sense, maybe in a future meetup, if anybody actually wants to read through one of those and bring some information back, I would definitely welcome more of an in-depth talk from just the internals of Hotwire, because I've really tinkered with it and I've used it in production, but it's been fairly limited. And somebody who could come in and say, this is why this works this way. I would really welcome that as a talk if you would be willing to do that. So cool. Any closing thoughts? Anything that you noticed about Ruby or Rails that we didn't cover today that you think is really interesting?
Pretty big aside, but isn't Heroku having like massive problems at the moment?
Yeah, that's a good point. So two kind of big things. Heroku's been having a massive security problem that seems like maybe it's still ongoing. I'm not really sure, but some GitHub access keys were apparently compromised. So one thing to do is if you have any Heroku apps that are tied directly to the deploy from GitHub functionality, then go look at those and make sure that you haven't had any security activity going on there. I'm trying to remember, I think it's activity maybe. Oh shoot, hang on. I'm looking at the wrong screen and I've got Zoom in the way. But I think there was like an activity. Nope. I'll try to follow up from this with. security activity. There was a specific page that they recommended that you go to see all the people who had cloned your repo and with what, and you could look for access using that unauthorized key, like unauthorized access. So if you run into that, that's something important. The other thing that's really kind of interesting to me is Shopify has really visibly, publicly doubled down on Rails being their future, and Ruby. And so what they're doing, I've noticed this the most on Twitter. What they're doing is very publicly backing the work that like Aaron Patterson is doing at Shopify, as well as Eileen. I can't remember her name. She helped. They were both at GitHub previously, but they're really pushing like Rails and Ruby at scale and working on trying to even improve more what they've already done. So I'm not sure if I'll see it in their links, but they've been very, very active lately on Twitter, just talking about the investment that they're making in the future of Ruby and Rails, probably partly to counteract people who are saying that it's dead. So
Don't they have like Crystal or something that's like some superset of Ruby that they're working on? Or is that
Crystal is an LLVM. So it's, we actually had somebody that worked at Launch Scout for a while that was very active in Crystal. Crystal is an LLVM compiled language that has a syntax that's very, very similar to Ruby. And I can't remember if it's a subset or superset. But yeah, you're right. And it has a different, I think it has a different threading model by necessity and some other things like that, but very fast, almost like a C compiled implementation of Ruby. So I didn't see that they had invested in that, but it totally makes sense. Cool. So you mentioned Ruby Weekly, is that right?
Yeah. I saw the thing about what was it, Shopify investing in that. So
yeah, I always say Spotify when I mean Shopify. So if I said the wrong thing, my apologies, but Shopify is the one. Yeah, Shopify invests in research for Ruby at scale. That's the one. So all the people that say Ruby on Rails doesn't scale, I mean, that's already been disproved in the sense that you can't make it as a universal blanket statement. It just makes no sense. But you've got people like Shopify investing very heavily in the JIT, the Ruby JIT, and some other things to make it even more performant. And if you look at anything Aaron Patterson does, man, like he's so smart. he's always pulling in like garbage collection and talking through like how does the heap work and how do things get garbage collected out of it. And so sometimes I just look at his tweets and I think I'm just in awe. But yeah, there's lots of active development going on, especially with the Ruby language, especially in Shopify.
GitHub is essentially a large Ruby on Rails monolith, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of Ruby apps out there like that. And GitHub was previously the employer of Aaron Patterson, and Eileen Codes is her name. I cannot remember her actual, like that's her Twitter handle. Give me just a second. I need to do better justice. I think it's, yeah. Okay, yeah. I think she was instrumental in their upgrade to Ruby 6, I want to say, and pulling out a lot of their custom, or Rails 6, and pulling out a lot of their custom GitHub things and converting them and sending them upstream to be part of Rails. So yeah, she's on the Rails core team. I want to say Aaron Patterson is on the core Ruby team, and they're both at Shopify, really picking up the gauntlet that they, that GitHub, I guess, dropped, but pretty exciting. All right, well, we're out of time. We're a few minutes over, so I apologize for that, but thank you for joining today. I hope it was interesting. This wasn't so much a presentation as it was just exploring together, so I hope that you got something out of it.
That's fun.
Thanks, Tim. That was super interesting.
Cool. Okay, I'll see everybody else later.
Thanks.